So actually, we're not going to talk about organic land care design. I'm not even sure what that might be, but maybe I should. But what we are going to talk about is actually below the soil level. So I'd like to start with some learning objectives. All right, so hopefully at the end of my 35, 40 minutes, whatever, I will have touched on all of these for you. First, the Atlanta BeltLine. How many of you have been on the BeltLine? Wow. How many of you have been on the BeltLine other than the East Side Trail? Oh, I applaud you. That's very good. So the Atlanta BeltLine encompasses a 22-mile, not exactly oval, but both abandoned and active railroad that was built in the late 19th century to allow freight rail to bypass Atlanta if they could, because back then it was a mess when everybody came into downtown. I'm sorry? Oh, okay. I was going to say, that wasn't one of my jokes that I had. Okay, I'll take it. So we own from about here up by Buford Highway and 85, all the way around to somewhere sort of in here. That's what we call our J. Those were three separate lines that the last active rail was actually the southeast. We just bought that last year. Before that, sections were abandoned in the 80s and 90s because they no longer had any clients in town. The northwest and north, we have two options, neither one of them very good because one is active CSX, one is active Norfolk Southern, and somehow we have to figure out how to get our cute little streetcar in amongst the large freight trains. The purple you see on this are schools, the larger ones obviously universities, and the green is existing open space. We are more than a streetcar project, we are more than a park project, although I'm obviously focused on the park portion, along with streetscape and trails. We are a multimodal project that affords people various opportunities of how they can get around Atlanta without using a car. I am a generalist. I am not focused, as some of the previous speakers were, on their particular areas of expertise. I basically need to know a little about a lot. I almost said a lot about a little, because that would be wrong. What I really need to do is know enough to be smart enough to know who I need to hire to solve my problems. And so far I think we've done pretty well, and hopefully when we're all done, people will say, yeah, they did. So we're going to talk about not the humus layer, but the A horizon, topsoil, and the B horizon, subsoil, mostly the A horizon. So let's start with, oops, somebody walked off with my notes. Well, I may fumble a little bit here. So this is Fritz Haber, German scientist who in the early 20th century figured out how to extract nitrogen from the air and then gave us ammonium nitrate. The god of our profession, Frederick Law Olmsted. Oh. Frederick Law Olmsted, who really started to introduce large expanses of turf into his landscapes, both when he developed residential areas and obviously Central Park, Prospect Park, many of his landscapes, which flows then to the quintessential suburbia post-World War II of Levittown. And if you had this lovely front yard with this beautiful lawn, of course you had to maintain it. So how did you do that? You got yourself a spreader, you got yourself some fertilizer, ammonium nitrate, and I really hope that as these kids grew up, they found things other than a spreader that were really interesting. Because their life was going nowhere. This was the high point. Whoops. And what does that lead to? What is the, to me at least, the major constraint of petroleum-based ammonium nitrate fertilizers? They're very short-lived. I'm sorry, if somebody said that, I couldn't hear it. The reason there are 5 bags here is because you have to keep doing it to keep your lawn green. And of course, it has to be green all the time. I'm only hitting this once, I don't know what's going on. So in addition to wanting to keep it green, you can't have any bugs in your lawn. You can't have any weeds in your lawn. So we have herbicides, fungicides, pesticides, and we basically nuked our soil. We turned it into a barren wasteland, and it's really sort of starting in the 70s, maybe the 60s. I can remember reading organic gardening even before I went back to school, to get my degree. Although it didn't really stick with me, which I'll explain in a moment. But really starting to look at a healthy soil and what that means. So who benefits from a healthy soil? This was actually a picture I took out of Landscape Architecture magazine of all places, with the credit on the bottom there. I just think it's a really cool picture. And I'm preaching, you all know, we obviously want to protect our bees. Before I came here to Atlanta in 2009, I spent 14 years working on the Big Dig in Boston, where I met a gentleman named Chip Osborne. We, at the time, were, when I say we, at the time I was working for the Massachusetts Turnpike Authority, and we were going to be in charge of the public open space that resulted from taking down the elevated highway. If you were never in Boston before 1998, 99, you won't know what that means, but imagine an elevated highway where this park space is. We decided we were going to maintain it sustainably and organically. I had thought I'd been a pretty good landscape architect to that point. I had no idea how much I fell short of that goal. Chip is a nationally recognized expert, specifically on the care of, organic care of turf. You can have a discussion, and Andrea will speak next on how we shouldn't have any turf at all. Nope, I thought that might get a rise. He actually was running a flower shop and greenhouse in Newburyport, Mass. And he had a bunch of dogs, and they used to like the cool dirt under his tables. And his dogs started to die of cancer. And he realized because they were getting soaked by all the chemicals he was dousing his flowers with. He sold the business, went into being a consultant. In 1999, the city of Newburyport passed a law that said all public spaces, including sports fields, had to be maintained organically, and he did that for 10 years. It's a fascinating story, and if you ever get a chance to hear him speak, it's well worth it. So here's where we get to the crux of it. The soil food web. Most of you, I'm guessing, have probably seen this before. And I loved the term this morning, eating sunshine. I'm going to use that a lot in the future. So we start with photosynthesis. Plants grow, the plants start to shed organic matter. bacteria, fungi, it goes to nematodes, ciliates, everything you see on there, and it works its way up the food chain. And in addition to what's going on there, since I'm not a scientist, I just call it the critters. The critters are eating each other, decomposing, pooping. If they're earthworms, they're burrowing holes, allowing air and water to move through the soil. And you can actually reach what's called nutrient cycling. And that term means where the system is so well developed, you really don't need to add anything to it. Everything that's coming off all these animals is being reused, available to the plants. And if you've got turf, hopefully those of you who have lawns, you're not picking up your grass clippings, you're letting them degrade back in. That'll give you 1/3 of the amount most lawns need for nitrogen. Now, this is the part where I'm going to have to start reading some things, because as I said, I'm not a scientist. Heterotroph, an organism deriving its nutritional requirements from complex organic substances. I hope that makes some sense to you, because it still doesn't make much sense to me, and I've read it I don't know how many times. But basically, it's a function of, to understand the soil microbiology even a little bit, you have to sort of take in your mind and bore into this at a much lower level that most of us can't even comprehend. And then sorry, that was the heterotroph. Autotrophs, an organism that somehow gets nutritional organic substances from simple inorganic substances such as carbon dioxide. So all these are working together, and then we have mycorrhizal fungi. These are a fungi on the roots of the plant, and it's a symbiotic relationship, the plant taking the sunshine and the energy that's created by that, passing it to the fungi, basically feeding the fungi. The fungi facilitate the transfer of nutrients to the roots, and also to some degree, very small scale, also help protect the roots. Now, most soils have sufficient mycorrhizal fungi in the soil itself. There, I'm sure, are conditions where, for one reason or another, that might not be the case. You can buy bags of mycorrhizal fungi and incorporate them into the soil. When you plant shrubs, trees, flowers, whatever you're doing, you're certainly not going to hurt anything by doing that, and they're not particularly expensive. You can find bags of these for 10 or 15 bucks, and you can be very conservative with incorporating the fungi into the soil. So if you're not familiar with mycorrhizal, there are a number of benefits in addition to what I've said with what we have up here. And it really is part of that. Now, you have to start to understand and realize that when we start to add or use herbicides and fungicides, particularly fungicides, you're starting to kill the very essence of the microbiology that we all need to have a healthy ecosystem. Now you're not, there we go. The other part that we need to know about are exudates. This is another one I'm going to have to read. Actually, no, I don't. I think I do know this one. So exudates are chemicals that are created on the outside of the roots, and they act both as a transfer into the soil, but more importantly, to attract chemical compounds that all the critters that we talked about before have produced, to make those available to the plant to take up and use in growth. The other function, which is very important, is they act as a defense mechanism. Not all fungi are beneficial. Some will try and attack the roots to destroy them. If you have a healthy soil microbiology, you have exudates, they will ward off those attacks along with nematodes. I'm not going to stand here and try and tell you that this is a 100% guarantee that if you have healthy soil microbiology, that nothing will touch your plants. But it reduces substantially the impact of any of that on your plants. So how many of you got a handout photocopy? Good. So when I started this, I had been at a conference last fall, and I actually had never heard of biophilia before, and read the book, and in what the handout that you have is, to me, possibly the greatest description of soil microbiology I've ever read. And I was going to read it to you. And everybody I suggested that I was going to do that looked at me like I was the dumbest person on the face of the earth and said, absolutely not, you don't do that. So we've saved about 3 minutes, get us back on track time-wise. You can take that with you, but it really is, if you don't have that book, it is really a wonderful book, and it's not very long, it's not very expensive. I strongly encourage you to grab hold of it. Now we're going to talk a little bit about soil and soil reports. How many of you have done soil tests on your own properties? Not enough hands up in the air. So this first one is a very basic one. This is, let's see, 4th Ward South. This is historic 4th Ward Park. We're not very creative in naming our parcels, so this is just the south parcel. If you've been to historic 4th Ward Park, this is actually the one that has the splash pad and the play area. So what we learned from this, and this is the native soil, which is in an urban environment. So when I say native, I simply mean it's the soil that was there. Don't know where it came from, probably was not original 100 years ago. But if you look at this, it's actually very general in terms of the soils that we on the Beltline encompass, and that is roughly between 55 and 65% sand. When I came here from the north, I watched movies, I read books, I had what turned out to be a completely erroneous idea of Georgia clay. And before I left, one of the people I worked with was a soil specialist, and he said, you're going to love the colloidal clay. I didn't know what the hell he was talking about. But I got down here and started to see this, and see that our soils actually grade out as sandy loams. Now, when you look at this, one thing that's missing, which could take you to the next layer, is particularly the sand. All that's just a general classification. It doesn't say whether the sand is fine grained or coarse grained. If you think about walking on the beach, the Atlantic or any of the oceans, in that intertidal zone, and there's water with the sand, and it's very fine particles, and it's like walking on a hard surface. Take the water away, go up out of the water zone, and you're going to get a really good workout on your legs if you walk for too awfully long. The benefits of the sand matter whether it's a mix. If it's all fines, you're going to have a not very productive soil because that's going to tend to compact. Next one is our standard soil test from UGA. And what's missing from the 4 or 5 bars on the left there? Nitrogen. Why is the nitrogen not calculated? I'm sorry? Yep. So anytime you test for nitrogen, it's a snapshot in time. and it's going to vary up and down radically. So somewhere along the line, they decided that we're not going to show that. And the nice thing that UGA does is give you an idea of the line, and if you're above that, you don't need to add, or it tells you what you do or don't need to add. So I would submit that the potassium is close enough that you really don't need to add phosphorus or potassium to this soil. So generally the recommendation is always apply 10-10-10. Well, based on this, you'd be wasting a lot of money. You can go to, also our pH over here, 6.6. On the BeltLine, we range from, that's probably the lowest we've ever had. And it's actually some areas on the East Side Trail, it's upwards of 8.3. And none of us can figure out how it's that high. And it's in one specific area, which just makes it more hard to understand. pH. Anyone here a scientist, a soil scientist, or a chemist? Good, so you can all try and answer this. Who knows the definition of pH? Okay, that's more than I remember.
The negative log of the hydronium ion concentration.
Wow. Yes, base 10 logarithm of molar concentration measured in units of moles per liter. We don't need to know that. All we need to know is that somebody determined that there's a range in which the uptake of nutrients is facilitated best based on the pH level. So roughly, let's say 6 to about 7.5, maybe 8, but you're starting in the micronutrients to have issues with that. That doesn't mean if you have a pH over 8 or in New England, having a pH of 4.5 wasn't unusual, which was great for azaleas and rhododendrons and mountain laurel. You just have to know what your soil pH is and adjust your plant selection based on that. That's good. For a second, I didn't think it wanted you to see what this slide was about. So the next level you can go to is a soil lab that specializes particularly in agricultural soils. And this used to be called A&L, now they're called Waypoint. We've used them quite a bit. And you can see that it's starting to give you a much greater explanation of what's in your soil. It's also starting to include cation exchange, which is basically the ability of the soil to retain nutrients that are thereby available to the plant. That's a very unscientific explanation, but I believe it covers it. And all you really need to know is if your cation exchange, capacity is above 11, then it should be pretty good. If it's below that, it's been so long since I've had to deal with that, I can't really tell you how you improve it, but I'm guessing if we improve our soil microbiology, the cation exchange capacity will also go up. And then the ultimate is to send a sample of your soil to the Soil Food Web. They don't care about your levels of phosphorus and potassium because they're looking at active fungi, active bacteria ratios. They've determined, based on the work, I think primarily of Elaine Ingham, who used to be at Oregon State before she went off on her own, of what the levels are, good levels are. So this is one of our early parks. And as you can see from this, some of these were pretty good, some of these weren't. We were new to this. We're hopefully getting better, but let's look at two particular. One is ciliates. Ciliates are one of those critters that are an indicator as to how good your biology is. If that number is high, you're starting to approach anaerobic conditions. So that's one telltale as to the condition of your soil. The other one that this is fascinating is nutrient cycling. What this says is what is the capacity of the soil to provide nitrogen. If you can get to 150 pounds an acre of nitrogen, you don't need to add any other nitrogen. We had a park, when we were doing our initial parks, we included 2 years of organic land care. And we were fortunate that we found a gentleman who lived up in Franklin, Tennessee, studied not in terms of going to school, but through workshops with Elaine Ingham, and had started a compost tea company. The parks, which were 2 sports fields south of Grant Park, we built them, both turf. If we had any idea how much Parks was going to program those fields and beat them to death, we would have put in artificial turf fields. But he actually was able, through 3 or 4 applications of compost tea a year over 2 years, to achieve nutrient cycling on at least the larger soccer field. So it can be done. It's a goal of ours. We don't need to talk about that. Important part of this, and I'm sure a lot of you will, because other people have discussed this today, when you're buying plants, make sure your grower doesn't use particularly neonicotinoids, other pesticides in the growth. That sounds like it should be very simple, but if you've got a large production facility and you're trying to grow things to sell, it can be an issue with whether you're going to lose your crop or not. Then just another lovely interlude with another one of our friends. Compost tea. How many of you brew your own compost tea? Okay, well hopefully if I were to come back next year and ask the same question, we might have a few more, because it's really not that hard to do. I used to do this. Did I have that picture? No, that's on the next one. So for about $60 to buy a 5-gallon plastic bucket, to buy a 2-gallon sprayer, 2 air stones like you would use in an aquarium, a pump, and some decent compost. And if you live in the Atlanta metro area, Farmer D's. If you live down in the coast, Karen and Mike Love, Longwood Plantation would be a good source. Well, bags are gone, that's right, 2 people just took them. Soil Cube, I've never seen their product before, but if it's a good compost, great. Actively aerated compost tea seeks to do what our grandparents and great-grandparents used to do by hanging bags of manure in a rain barrel, and then taking that and putting it on the garden. That's not bad, but it really doesn't bulk up the organisms to the degree that injecting oxygen does. So if you want to try this, get this, if you're on city water, particularly if they put fluoride or chlorine in, which most of them do, you need to gas off the water, which means you run the pump and the bubbler for at least 24 hours. And you basically will end up with your version of distilled water. At that point, you take a bag. You can do this 2 ways. You can either just put the compost into the bin, into the bucket, or you can put it in a, I've seen people use everything from stockings to cheesecloth. and suspend it. The water aerates around it. The organisms multiply almost exponentially, and you need to only do this for about 24 to 48 hours. You then can take your 2-gallon sprayer, and if you just dump the compost in, you need to strain it out. And most 2-gallon sprayers that you get at Lowe's or Ace or wherever you're buying it have very fine meshes. And you either need to cut that off, or you need to look for a screen that has at least a 400 gauge screen on it, which apparently is large enough to prevent any of the debris from the compost from getting in and clogging your nozzle, but allowing the critters to make it through. I would also suggest, if you're going to do this, when you go to apply to your lawns, your shrubs, your flowers, whatever you want to do, or all of the above, that you do this right about sunset. Don't do this at 11 o'clock in the morning, because the sun will bake them all these good little things before they can make their way into the soil. And if you want to, you can actually send your compost tea to the soil food web. To do that, you really need to go overnight delivery, and it's still going to be a little bit of a not perfect, because once you seal it off and you stop with the oxygen, you have about 2 to 3 hours to use that brew before it starts a slow decline as portions start to die off. So this is, if you're from Atlanta, you may have heard of Love is Love Farm. It's a CSA operation in southeast Atlanta. The dog is our third, well, I was about to say third golden retriever. But obviously that would be a lie. She was only 50% golden retriever. And I think the mention of this morning was of needy, and they certainly are. But she is in our lawn, which I never fertilized other than compost tea and the clippings. Now, that's not Bermuda, which is different. That's a mix of bluegrass and rye, and cut to about 3 inches high. But it was about as close to that Levittown lawn as you could get without any inputs other than compost tea. If you want to make your own compost, most of you probably know this already. One of the things I really like is they list manure here and then say no animal byproducts. I'm not sure what else manure would be classified as. But you need to know the adage, if you haven't heard it already, not all compost is created equal. I distinctly remember back in the 90s reading an article of compost that was applied commercially on landscapes in Southern California, and it had not been cooked properly to a high enough level to kill off residual herbicides that had been in the base material, the leaves, the grasses, things like that. So when it was applied to the landscape, all the plants that it fell on or were near started to croak. So you need to know where it's coming from. Really important, you shouldn't be able to tell what the component particles were. It should just be looking like rich earth. The other part, ammonia. One of our first parks, the one I mentioned about the south of Grant Park, walked onto a site during construction, getting ready to finish grade the fields, and there's a big pile of compost ready to be tilled in. Sorry, Jennifer, but everything we do is old industrial sites or has extensive construction operations on it, so we have to till. And I didn't get but 40 feet away from that pile, and I could smell ammonia. And I just go, what are you doing? this is no good. And gee, we're really sorry. We had a big government contract for Fort Stewart, and we didn't have any finished compost, but in order to meet the deadline for your project, we sent you this. Well, that's wonderful. You get to take it back. And the company who supplied that in 2010 has never supplied any more compost to the Atlanta BeltLine. And that was a really bad decision because we use a lot of it. For those of you, as I said, down in the coast, Karen and Mike love. Karen grows native plants on Longwood Plantation. In Atlanta, Farmer G's sells his compost. Great source, whether you're going to make compost tea or just incorporate compost into your landscape. There's a difference, bacterial versus fungal. For lawns, you want predominantly bacterial, predominantly green or wet materials. For fungal, think of the woodland. What's the constituent parts that make up that humus layer of a forest floor? You can adjust by adding humic acids, seaweed. Elaine Ingham's first book, which I would encourage you to get, if you can get it through your library. I forgot to mention this before when it was up on the screen. Apparently it's out of print. To buy it, it now costs $120 on Amazon. I wouldn't encourage anybody to spend that much. But if your library can get it, it's definitely worth a read. Her first volume talked about adding sugar-free molasses as a source to increase the fungal component. For reasons I'm not quite sure of, subsequently she came out and said, no, you really shouldn't add molasses. If you want to add it, go ahead. It's not really going to hurt anything. But you can start to play with the components that go into your tea and what you're going to do. Lawns and flowers, bacterial works best. Shrubs, trees, it's more for fungal dominated. Just another, if you're interested in organic land care for your home, Northeast Organic Farmers Association, and in full disclosure, I'm no longer an accredited organic land care professional, not for any particular reason other than there's no courses in Georgia that I could keep up my accreditation. When we were running the organic symposium, they allowed me to count that as my credits. Eventually, BeltLine decided to stop funding us, and I didn't have enough time to go out and find funding. So we did that for about 4 or 5 years, and then stopped. So that's why I'm no longer. These are both really good books to inform you. Another part of organic land care, which goes back to the Levittown lawns and all of that, is an understanding of how perfect does your landscape need to be? What level of imperfection is acceptable? And each of you will have a different view of that. We all know this is a rhododendron leaf that has been munched. Really? Sorry, there was supposed to be a picture come up of a taxus weevil. The little critter that eats these. Jeez. Turn my back for one moment. If you're standing this close to this plant, you may think, well, this doesn't, may start to think this looks sort of horrible. Trust me, if you're back 10 feet from this plant, you can't tell that those small indentations are even there. So would you do any spraying or treatment to try and kill that? Hopefully the answer of everybody would be no. That just goes to the whole point of what you're able to accept. Hans Seeley was an author in the late 50s who wrote a book called The Stress of Life. His book was focused primarily on the impact of stress on humans, and he, as you can see, had a number of stages. Subsequently, a number of people believe that a lot of what he had to say also applies to plants. We know that plants under stress, be it compaction of the soil over the roots, removing air and water, putting the tree in stress, whatever it might be, makes plants more susceptible to disease. Again, a healthy microbiology, soil microbiology, helps mitigate this. And I think I've pretty much said what I need to say on that. So interesting talking about bugs this morning, insects. It's been a question of mine. Now, granted, I live in Atlanta, so that might automatically make me have fewer bugs than if I lived on a farm outside Valdosta. But still, I remember growing up just driving through the countryside. I grew up in north central Jersey, although my wife would still claim I haven't grown up yet. You know, if you had lights outside, bugs were all over the place, hundreds of them, thousands. When I lived in New Hampshire, I had friends who actually bought bug zappers. All they wanted to kill was the mosquitoes, and they killed everything else. But I also remember driving that literally on some nights you would have to stop and try and clean off your windshield because the wipers certainly weren't going to do it. And we've now gotten to the point where I don't know how many of you still have that experience, but it is. It's a real problem for society and the world in general for the reasons that were articulated this morning. So we all need to be proselytizing to everybody we know to make more and more people understand how important this is. You can be sure that nobody's going to stand up on the campaign trail and talk about insects. Various portions of the internet would laugh them off the stage, but we really need to make people understand how important this is. I don't know if I have any time left. If I do, I'm happy to take questions. If we want to get back on schedule and just have me walk off, that's fine too.